Introduction. Burning Questions is my third collection of essays and other occasional pieces. The first was Second Words, which began in 1960 when I started publishing book reviews and ended in 1982. The second was Moving Targets, which gathered materials from 1983 to mid 2004. Burning Questions runs from mid 2004 to mid 2021. So, 20 years, give or take, for each volume. Each of these time periods has been tumultuous in its own way. Occasional pieces were written for specific occasions and thus tightly connected to their own time and place, or at least mine are. They're also linked to my age at the time of writing and to my outward circumstances. Did I have a job? Was I a student? Did I need the money? Was I already a well known writer, indulging my interests? Was I doing a freebie in response to a cry for help? In 1960, I was 20, single, unpublished in book form, and a female undergraduate of limited wardrobe. In 2021, I was 81, a fairly well known writer, a grandmother, and a widow, also of limited wardrobe, having learned through failed experiments that there are some things better left unworn by me. Naturally, I have changed. My hair is a different color, but so has the world. The past 60 odd years have been a roller coaster with many shocks and upheavals, many uproars and reversals. The year 1960 was only a decade and a half after the end of the Second World War. To our generation, that war felt both very close. We had lived through it. Our families contained veterans and casualties. Some of our high school teachers had been in it and very far away. Between 1950 and 1960 had come both McCarthyism, giving us a peek at the fragility of democracy, and Elvis, a pending song and dance. The clothes, too, had changed radically. The 1940s were somber, durable, military, boxy. The 1950s, frothy, strapless, bouffant, pastel, beflowered. Femininity was lauded. The cars had gone from dark, unclosed sedans of the war years to chrome trimmed convertibles in flamboyant colors. Transistor radios were among us. Drive in theaters popped up. Plastics arrived. Then, in 1960, there was another change. Among the earnest young folk songs replaced formal dances. In the tiny artistic circles that then existed in Toronto coffee houses, inclined as they were to French existentialism rather than beatniks, black turtlenecks, and equally black eyeliner were in vogue. Still, the early 1960s were the 1950s, in essence. The Cold War was on, Kennedy had not yet been assassinated, there was no birth control pill generally available, there were no miniskirts, though there had just been short shorts. There were no hippies, there were no second wave women's movement. It was in this period that I wrote my first book reviews, my first collection of poems, my first novel, still in a drawer, happily, and my first published novel, The Edible Woman. By the time it came out in 1969, the world it describes was already gone. The later 1960s brought uproar. The big civil rights marches in the United States, the anti Vietnam War protests, the hundreds of thousands of American draft dodgers pouring into Canada. I myself was constantly in transit. For some of these years, I was a graduate student in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For others, I held minor academic positions in such places as Montreal and Edmonton. I moved 16 or 17 times. This period saw the formation of a number of new publishing ventures in Canada, many of them connected with the country's post colonial struggle to figure itself out. My involvement with one of them gave rise to much essay writing, both at the time and later. Then came the 1970s, the ferment of second wave women's movement, followed by reaction and burnout towards the end. In Canada, Quebec separ- separatism occupied the central of the political stage. The period saw the arrival of several authoritarian regimes: Pinochet in Chile and the Argentinian Chinata, with their murders and disappearances, the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia with its wholesale slaughters. Some were right, some were left, but no ideology. It was clear had a monopoly on atrocities. I continued to write book reviews, as well as the novels, stories, and the poems I felt were my real work, but I also branched out into articles and speeches. Quite a few of these were about subjects that still occupy my shrinking brain: women's issues, writing and writers, human rights. I was now a member of Amnesty International, which worked for free prisoners of conscience, largely through letter writing campaigns. By 1972, I had ceased to have academic jobs and had got freelance, so I was taking any paid work I could pick up. We were living on a farm and had a small child as well, as a small budget. We were not poor, though one visitor told people we were nothing but a goat. No goats in reality, they were sheep, but we were not rolling in cash. We grew a lot of vegetables and kept chickens and other non human residents. This mini agribus took time and also lost money. So if I could make a bit of cash from writing rather than egg sales, all to the good. The 1918s began with our movement from farm to Toronto for school reasons, among others, the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States, and the rise of religious right. In 1981, I began thinking about The Handmaid's Tale, though I put off writing it until 1984 because the concept seemed too far fetched. My output of occasional writing sped up, partly because with a child in school, I had more free time during the day, and partly because I was getting more requests. Looking back at my sporadic, badly kept, and not very informative journals, I note that one of the leitmotifs is a constant moaning about taking on too much. This has to stop, I find myself saying. Some of the pieces I was writing were in response to pleas for help, and so it has continued. Just say no, people told me, and I told myself. However, if you're asked to write 10 occasional essays a year and say no to 90% of them, then comes to one essay a year. But if you're asked to write 400 pieces, and if you say to 90% of them, how firm and virtuous you are, there are still 40 pieces a year. I've been averaging 40 a year for the past couple of decades. There's a limit. This has to stop. To resume our chronology, the Cold War and the Soviet system crumbled in the 1989 as the Berlin Wall came down. The end of the history had occurred, and we were told capitalism was the way forward, shopping was king, your lifestyle choices defined you, and what more could women want? Not to mention minorities, referred to in Canada among politicians and government bureaucrats, or so my spies told me, as multi eths, people who spoke languages other than French and English, and Fizimans, people who were not white. They were both want quite a bit more. It was soon to become evident, but it was not very evident in the 1990s. There were stirrings, there were rumblings, there were wars and political coups and conflicts everywhere. But there were not yet explosions. It can happen here was still the attitude. After 2001, when with the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, everything changed. Former assumptions were challenged, former comforts flew out the window, former truisms were no longer true. Fear and suspicion were the order of the day, and that is where Burning Questions begins. Why the title? Possibly because the questions we've been faced with so far in the 21st centuries are more than urgent. Every age thinks that about its own crisis, of course, but surely this era feels different. First, the planet. Is the world itself truly burning up? Is it we who've been setting fire to it? Can we put those fires out? What about the highly unequal distribution of wealth? Not only in North America, but virtually everywhere. Can such a top heavy and unstable arrangement possibly last? How soon before the 99% get fed up and set fire to the figurative Bastille? Then there's democracy. Is it in peril? What do we mean by democracy anyway? Has it ever actually existed in the essence of equal rights for all citizens? Are we serious about all genders, all religions, all ethnic origins? In this system we call democracy worth preserving or else pursuing? What do we mean by freedom? How much speech should be freely uttered and by whom and about what? The social media revolution has given unprecedented power to online conglomeration of people that are called movements if you like them or mobs if you don't. Is this good or bad or just an extension of old-fashioned crowds in motion? Does burn it all down, a popular slogan in our times, mean all? Really? For instance, does all mean all words? What about the creatives, as some are in the habit of calling them? What about writers and writing? Are they, are we to be mere mouthpieces reeling out acceptable platitudes that are supposed to be good for society? Or do we have some other function? If it's a function of which others disapprove, shall our books be burned? Why not? It's been done before. There is nothing inherently sacrosanct about a book. These are some of the burning questions I've been asked, and I have asked myself over the course of past 2 decades. Here are some of the answers, or should I say some of the attempts? That's what essays mean, after all, an attempt, an effort. I've arranged this book into 5 parts. Each is marked by an event or a turning point. Part 1 begins in 2004. In the aftermath of the Twin Towers and Pentagon attacks, the Iraq War was going. I was still traveling for Oryx and Crake, 2003, the first book of the Madadam trilogy, plotted around the double crisis, the climate crisis and the species extinction precipitated by it, and a pandemic plague enabled by gene splicing. In 2003, 2004, these premises seemed remote. Now, not so much. Part 1 ends in 2009 as the world was still staggering from the big financial crash of October 2008, the very moment at which I was publishing Payback, Dead, and The Shadow Side of Wealth. Some people thought I had a crystal ball. I didn't. Part 2 runs from 2010 to 2013. In these 4 years, Obama was the US president and the world was slowly recovering from the financial meltdown. I was mostly occupied with the writing of Madadam, the third novel in the Madadam trilogy. Once you've published a book, you're often asked why you did it, as if you've stolen an ashtray, and you will find me in one of these essays dutifully trying to account for my crime. My essay writing life was varied. I continued to produce reviews, introductions, and unfortunately, obituaries. The climate crisis was becoming an ever hotter topic, and I found myself writing about it more often. In 2012, my partner Graham Gripson was diagnosed with dementia. Uh, what's the prognosis? He asked. It will go slowly, it will go quickly, it will stay the same, or we don't know, he was told. It was much the same with the state of the world. It was a restless, unsettled period without any single overwhelming catastrophe. People were fearful, but their fear was unfocused. We were holding our breath. We were carrying on. We were pretending things were normal. But whiffs of a change for the worse were already in the air. Part 3 gathers essays from 2014 to 2016. The run up to the 2016 election in the United States was already beginning. At the time, the television series of The Handmaid's Tale was in preparation. It would begin shooting in August 2016, and a miniseries of Alias Grace about the 19th century prisoner and possible murderess was also being filmed. Freedom and its opposites were thus much on my mind. Around this time, I began work on The Testaments, the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale that would appear in 2019. By the end of 2016, a zeitgeist change was surely upon us. With the election of Donald Trump as US president, we had fully entered the strange land of post truth, a land we would live in until 2020, though some, it appears, are determined to keep living in it. Part 4 begins in 2017 when America feared The Handmaid's Tale might not be fiction after all. The inauguration of President Trump was followed immediately by a massive international women's march. This was a time of much hand wringing in the anguish in the United States. What next? How close to a rollback of women's rights were we? Was an authoritarian regime on its way? When the TV series of The Handmaid's Tale launched in April, it found an audience it didn't need to convince. In the same year, the Alias Grace miniseries was streamed. Alias Grace was how we'd been, and The Handmaid's Tale was how we might be. After hackers made a protracted attempt to steal the manuscript online, one of the more bizarre episodes in my writing life, The Testaments was published in September 10, 2019. This period also we saw the rise of the Me Too movement. The overall effect of Me Too was, I believe, positive, in the notice was given that Harvey Weinstein behavior could no longer expect to pass unreproved. But the pros and cons of the social media denunciations are still being debated, and the culture wars are going on. Against this background, I wrote about the need for truth, fact checking, and fairness, as did the chroniclers of the Weinstein case, the Bill Cosby case, and many others. These 3 years were difficult ones for Graham and me. Graham's condition worsened gradually through 2017 and 2018, then more precipitously through the first half of 2019. We knew we had only a limited time left together, months, not years. Graham wished to depart while he was still himself, and he got his wish. A day and a half after the launch of The Testaments in the National Theatre, London, England, he had a massive cerebral hemorrhage, entered a coma, and died 5 days later. Some may have been surprised that I carried on with the book tour for The Testaments after Graham's death. But given a choice between hotel rooms and events and people on one hand, and an empty house and a vacant chair on the other, which would you have chosen, dear reader? Of course, the empty house and the vacant chair were simply postponed. They came later my way, as such things do. Part 5 begins in 2020. This was the election year in the 2000 United States, and a bizarre election year it was, compounded by COVID-19, which struck in earnest in March. I was asked to write a number of COVID-related pieces. What was I doing all day? What were our prospects? Totalitarianisms were preoccupying me. The worldwide drift in that direction was alarming, as were various authoritarian moves being made in the United States. Were we yet again witnessing the crumbling of a democracy? In the fall of 2020, my poetry collection Dearly was published. I included one of the pieces I wrote about it. Graham was much on my mind. It was a pleasure to write the foreword to his bedside book of birds and the introduction to his last two novels, both of which were being reissued. I end Burning Questions with pieces about two key conservationists, Barry Lopez and Rachel Carson, whose work I predict will become increasingly important as we on planet Earth face an increasingly uncertain future. The inheritors of Lopez and Carson and the many other early voices who warned us about growing climate crisis are the young generations of post millennials, whose best voice is Greta Thunberg. In the mid 20th century, when Rachel Carson was first published, it was convenient to deny, avoid, and postpone, but this is no longer possible. That is, if we want to remain a species on this planet. The post millennials will soon grow into positions of power. Let us hope they use their power wisely and soon.